Welcome back. You're watching World Insights coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Let's turn to the latest on China-U.S. trade war. The two countries are set to begin a new round of trade talks from Thursday to Friday in Washington. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will lead the delegation and negotiate with the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. From the U.S. side, key members of the Chinese delegation include the representatives from the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, as well as from the central bank. Last month, in a sign of goodwill, both sides made concessions by suspending some planned tariffs. However, on Monday, the U.S. Commerce Department said it was putting 28 Chinese entities on a U.S. trade blacklist. The upcoming trade talks come 1 week before the U.S. plans to impose a 30% tariff increase on Chinese products. Whether the latest round can produce any deal or any consensus is still anyone's guess. For more on China-U.S. trade talks in Washington, D.C., we're joined by William Li, Chief Economist of the Mnuchin Institute. In Philadelphia, we invited Nathan Mahboubi, who is a research scholar at the Center for Study of Contemporary China from the University of Pennsylvania. Last but not least, in Beijing, Liu Baocheng Din from the Center for International Business Ethics, University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. To you, Professor Liu, first, very briefly,
yes,
if you can, sir, is under the current circumstances, seems pressure is once again put from both sides onto each other, particularly from the U.S. side to the Chinese side, at least China sees it that way. So will these kind of pressure lead to result or exactly the opposite?
Well, there has been softened airs for a while, and it seems that the U.S. is very determined on its own track of containing China and trying to corner China to make more concessions to the U.S. agenda. I do not think now there's going to be any complete deal at the end of the tunnel, but rather hopefully even if they can achieve some sort of interim deal on certain technical level, for example, for rolling back some of the tariff, a certain percentage of tariff, or so China can purchase more. So that could be the best deal we can possibly have.
Well, you already gave a big prediction about what might be the deal or not deal, or what could be included in the deal if there were any deal. Mr. Li, you're smiling. I hope it's an optimistic smile, but go ahead and tell us what is your realistic assessment.
Well, let's remember what the facts are first. Last week, it was reported that Liu He has mentioned to several people that the agenda was going to be a shortened agenda, and that the Chinese were not willing to discuss intellectual property and many of the thornier items on the negotiating agenda. And because of that, we saw the reaction of the United States was to create that blacklist, and then there was more retaliations that went back and forth. So I think both sides are essentially trying to shake the negotiating table by putting many items out there to be negotiated upon, and not just one item. And I think that kind of multilateral negotiating strategy is one that makes the process perhaps a little bit more difficult and more complex, but it also gives room for bargaining. And I'm very hopeful that both sides will reach an agreement that we will want to continue to talk. That's the most important thing, is that if talking shuts down, nobody wins. But if talking continues, even if there's no apparent progress made, the progress is both sides reach a better understanding.
Okay. Mr. Mahboubi, I'm sure you heard Mr. Li, what he's trying to say. In plain words, at least I can tell, is at least there is talk, there is progress. The talk itself is already the progress. So, Mr. Mahboubi, what about your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that to some level. Of course, this is the 13th round of these trade negotiations, and presumably, if there isn't going to be certainly a major deal reached, but even potentially a minor deal reached, we're going to be seeing more rounds of negotiations. And at some point, the question will be how many rounds of negotiations can you go without any kind of a concrete any kind of agreement of any sort. I do think there's a kind of a conventional wisdom that's coalescing right now, certainly in the U.S., that there may be some kind of interim or preliminary deal that resolves some of the easier items, but then opens the way to later discussion, potentially after the election, at least sometime in the future, for some of the thornier issues.
Yeah.
And that could well be the way that the Chinese are approaching this negotiation. It just, for me, I'm not entirely clear that that's something that President Trump is going to sign off on, or that he's going to be able to sell within the U.S. And so I think it could be that the best we can hope for, as Mr. Li just said, is just continued talking for the foreseeable future.
Mr. Li, it seems that all of you agree on certain things. That is, what is happening with the negotiations should be pragmatic. But let's bear in mind, politics are usually not pragmatic, but rather working in a very different logic. And what we are seeing right now is politics probably is likely to design the agenda and the timetable. So how do you see that conflict in a way between these two factors?
Well, actually, domestic politics, I think, are generating much of the agenda items to be negotiated. After the National Day holidays that you have just celebrated, and President Xi has demonstrated that China really has arrived at being a formidable country, in the most powerful country in the world next to the United States, and I think that's an amazing amount of progress that China is well proud of. One of the things that he has to turn attention to, however, is that there are a lot of hardliners within the Chinese government, and he has to make sure that that base, the base of hardliners, is convinced that he's not giving away the shop. President Trump also has a base of hardliners, but also I think he has a base of moderates that he also has to appeal to in order to win the next election. And in order to get the moderates online, he has to reach a deal. And the deal he's going to shape is to convince President Xi that he has a lot to win by talking about the more difficult items of intellectual property and market access.
Professor Liu, now, since Mr. Li talked about the National Day celebration, obviously you can see from the Chinese leadership, it is rally the country through that demonstration, through that ceremony, rather, throughout the National Day celebrations. And you also see the Chinese economy doing pretty well, particularly if you look at the consumptions.
Right. All the restaurants are filled.
Over 1.4 billion busy consuming during the National Day holiday. That seems to be some sign of the economy is not necessarily going down, at least not for the foreseeable future. So what about that sign being read by Washington? What would that mean to them from the Chinese side assessment? And also, what does it mean for the timetable, immediate ones, particularly for the negotiation?
You know, from the U.S. side, I think it's now crystal clear that the war is not easy to win, as touted by Donald Trump. And from China's side, okay, you know, initially there was estimation that, okay, it's only the trade balance issue, but things are getting more and more complicated, and China was not really prepared to expand the entire, negotiation table with a lot of issues that may really conflict with each other. So China wanted to go for a clear track. Okay, here, you know, let's identify the most imperative problem and try to find a solution that are amicably acceptable on both sides. I think China is still there. So gradually, you know, over the 13 rounds of talks now with the coming one, so I think both sides would really know each other's bottom line.
Here's the thing, Mr. Mnuchin, who will identify the most important items? Will that be done by the negotiators, the immediate negotiating teams that are meeting in Washington very soon? Will that have to be done by the two leaders when they meet? For example, at the APEC summit, usually that's an occasion for the two to meet. And now we do not know whether the two will meet anyway on a bilateral basis. So what do you say?
Well, I think, you know, going back to the earlier discussion, both of these leaders are embedded in very complicated domestic politics. Obviously, the domestic politics in the U.S. is more visible right now. We just have to look at the president's Twitter feed to get a very quick, real-time sense of what's going on in his mind and in his political landscape. But President Xi Jinping is also navigating some very complicated domestic politics as well. And so I think on both sides, their room for action is very constrained by forces beyond their control. So it seems unlikely to me that they can just meet together, even if they do meet in November, that they can meet and they can resolve things in any comprehensive way. Whether they can reach some kind of a symbolic type of early stage agreement that resolves some very small low-hanging fruit, I suppose that's possible, but that's what these teams are going to be doing in D.C. In a couple of days anyway. So my bottom line is I do think that they're both very constrained by domestic forces and are both navigating very, very difficult situations. And so I think that leaves them both little room to kind of act on their own.
Well, that's one side of this story. But the other side of the story, Mr. Li, when the news is being released to the public that the two sides, the negotiation teams are going to meet once again, you look at the stock market, that certainly shows what the market is thinking about whether there should be or not any result of this trade negotiation, whether there should be any at all a trade war between China and the United States. We also look at the debate going on here in China about the importance of relationship with the United States throughout China's reform and opening up. That's also a very pro-result kinds of argument. So what about the complicated factors that we have seen overall? Is not just politics, but also some of the fundamental beliefs that both countries and markets around the world hold?
That's a great question, because let's remember that 13 rounds of trade negotiation is really barely touching the beginning when you don't look at historically how many rounds it takes to get WTO agreements to be done. That's why the multilateral system that exists now has been condemned by President Trump as being outdated, too slow, and inappropriate for today's modern age, when bilateral negotiations with China, with major trading partners, is really the way to go, and that's the way President Trump has structured his trade strategy. The thing that you mentioned about how the environment shapes the markets and the discussion in China about these bilateral relations, that is a very important factor, and it shows you that the best way to get to a goal may not be a straight line. And negotiations are often very tangential and take into account many considerations, and in taking into account many considerations, eventually progress is made. It's like when you throw a pebble into a pond, the waves start to spread from the center, and you never know which waves are the ones that are most important and which part of the circle will be the one that is most important. All of the parts of the circle, all of the parts of the wave are important, and how the talks are structured and how many rounds it takes is something that the environment will shape, both the market and the domestic discussion in China.
I love that analogy, Professor Liu, particularly if you look at the history as to how China and the United States eventually established diplomatic relations. That takes a lot of years, whether it's on the table, but most of the time under the table discussions, closed-door negotiations, so some kind of drama that you only see in history books. So, when it comes to important issues, there's always what you see, and there's always things which you don't see.
That's right.
Sometimes the latter is even more important than the former. So, Professor Liu, when we become smart observers of what's going on between the two countries, what do you believe as some of the things we really should see now, even on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the fundamental is interdependence is undeniable.
It's not a cliche what you're saying right now.
So
it is really the fundamentals that you're saying right now.
That's right. So you see that the trade war, how much injury is going to, it has already brought to American household and also to Chinese industries in certain sections. So the other is, to respect differences. Because the institutional setting, history, and vastly different. So if you really wanted to synchronize these two countries, it's a mission impossible.
Right.
And
third,
third,
okay, go ahead.
The third is really, also the, see the mutual benefit, because, if you really say, okay, my interest always first, so you place the other interest on second or last place, and nobody is going to engage into a sincere
Those are the
deals.
principles. Of course, it's politically correct to say those principles. Everybody will say it's politically correct. But the thing is whether those principles will be followed or not. So what should we see? What should we ignore? And Mr. Li, very briefly, if you have 30 seconds.
Well, what we should ignore is all the noise that we see in the markets and in the commentary. What we don't see is the talk that's going behind the scenes, and you're absolutely right. Eventually we will get to the solution, and history will tell us how we got there. But right now it's going to be very hard for us to see by looking at the surface. We must understand the negotiations take a long time, and they're often indirect.
Broke the stone while cross the river. That's what the Chinese say since the very beginning of the reform opening up. But your wisdom, Mr. Mahboubi, before we wrap it up. 30 seconds.
Just to say that I think there are a lot of different factors right now pushing the U.S. and China to a more confrontational relationship across a wide range of areas. And I think this trade negotiation is just one piece of the larger puzzle. It's symbolic, and I think, you know, having continued discussions and even potentially an interim agreement is useful, but we are in this larger environment of a more confrontational relationship, and I think that will be the larger story going forward, how that's managed, whether there will still be areas of discussion and cooperation within an overall much more confrontational relationship.
I see. Time is different, as you argue. Well, a lot of things need to bear in mind, whether it's history or the future. Thank you so much, the three of you, helping us to understand the latest. Mahboubi, Liu, and Li, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you.